The phone buzzed against the edge of Eleanor's wooden desk at the Oakhaven Town Library, the caller ID flashing, Harbor Point Bank, a completely ordinary ring that was about to shatter the quiet comfort of her Tuesday morning. Eleanor Vance, 55 and comfortably settled into the gentle rhythms of her life, adjusted her reading glasses and paused her work. The library smelled wonderfully of old paper, binding glue, and wood polish, with dust motes dancing lazily in the pale, crisp sunlight of early November. Outside the tall windows, the harsh Maine wind was already stripping the last brown leaves from the great oak trees, signaling the deep, freezing winter to come. For the past hour, she had been carefully organizing a front display of classic literature for the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. Thanksgiving was meant to be a time for deep gratitude, for community, and for family. Eleanor let out a soft, thoughtful sigh as she smoothed the cover of a book. Her relationship with her own parents, Walter and Dorothy, had always been a strained affair, a heavy, complicated knot of unspoken expectations and old-fashioned judgments regarding her choice to remain single and independent, but she still believed in the grace of the season. Assuming it was a routine courtesy call regarding her modest checking account, she swiped the screen to answer, her voice warm and melodic. "Good morning, this is Eleanor." David, the branch manager she had known and trusted for years, didn't return her cheerful greeting. His voice sounded remarkably tight, carrying a cautious hesitation that immediately made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Eleanor. I'm calling because we need to discuss the final closing documents for your beach house refinance. Why didn't you come into the branch yesterday to sign them?" Eleanor's hand froze mid-air over a stack of hardcover books. The beach house was her absolute sanctuary, a small, weathered property overlooking the ocean that she had painstakingly paid off 5 years ago. It was her haven, solely hers. "David, what are you talking about?" she asked, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "I never applied for a refinance. I don't have a mortgage." There was a heavy, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. When David finally spoke, his voice had dropped an octave, shifting from professional inquiry to genuine, guarded alarm. "Eleanor, your parents, Walter and Dorothy, came into the branch late yesterday afternoon." The words hit her chest like a physical blow. The air in the quiet library suddenly felt too thin to breathe. "They presented a signed authorization packet to one of our loan associates," David continued, his tone steady but laced with underlying concern. "They claimed they were acting entirely on your behalf to finalize the paperwork." The physical sensation of betrayal was instantaneous and suffocating. Eleanor gripped the edge of the heavy wooden desk, her knuckles turning white. Her parents. The people who had always criticized her independent life, who had openly dismissed her financial prudence, were secretly dealing with her property. They don't have power of attorney," Eleanor stammered, the warmth entirely drained from her voice, replaced by a cold, trembling shock. "David, they have absolutely no legal right to touch my home." To stop her heart from hammering wildly against her ribs, she instinctively reached into her heavy wool coat pocket. Eleanor absent-mindedly rubbed her thumb over a faded, crumpled receipt from the Oakhaven diner sitting in her coat pocket, a silent reminder of the crisp $10 bill she had discreetly left under a coffee saucer a month prior for a scruffy stranger. Her mind briefly pulled her away from the terrifying present, anchoring her to that freezing morning in October. The Oakhaven diner had been a haven of warmth against the autumn chill, rich with the comforting aroma of roasted drip coffee and sweet cinnamon. She had been sitting in her usual vinyl booth near the fogged-up front window when she noticed him. He was an older man, perhaps in his early 60s, sitting alone in the corner booth. He wore a frayed, oversized flannel jacket that looked entirely incapable of blocking the coastal wind. Faded, ink-blood tattoos marked his weathered hands, which were shivering slightly as he clasped them together over the empty table. The morning rush was in full swing, yet the diner's waitresses repeatedly walked past his table, their eyes sliding right over him with that subtle, silent judgment reserved for those society deemed undesirable or defeated. Eleanor hadn't seen a nuisance, she had seen a fellow human being who looked profoundly exhausted by life. Without a second thought of judgment or apprehension, she caught a waitress's attention. She quietly paid for a large, steaming mug of dark roast coffee and ordered a thick, warm slice of the diner's famous pecan pie to be sent to his table. As she stood up to leave, she walked past his booth, offered a gentle, respectful smile, and said, "Good morning, sir. Stay warm out there." She didn't wait for profound thanks. She simply slipped a crisp $10 bill under his saucer to ensure he wouldn't be rushed out into the cold, giving him the dignity of a paid seat. It was a simple, unconditional act of grace. "Eleanor. Are you still there?" David's urgent voice snapped her violently back to the present reality of the library. The comforting smell of old books offered no solace now. "I'm here," she whispered, her throat bone-dry. David then delivered the crushing, unimaginable blow. "Eleanor, this wasn't just a simple rate adjustment they pushed through. It's a cash-out transaction." He paused, as if gathering the courage to say the number aloud. "A total of $240,000. It has been approved, processed, and is currently sitting in our queue, preparing to be funded by the close of business today." The sum echoed in her mind. $240,000. The entire equity of her life's sanctuary, the safety net she had built over decades of quiet, honest labor, was about to be wiped out by her own flesh and blood. "I'm looking at the signature page right now, Eleanor," David said softly over the line, the tension radiating through the phone, "and the notary stamp on this document belongs to someone our fraud department has red flagged before. If you're still with Eleanor at this pivotal moment and find the layers of this story as gripping as I do, please leave a 8 in the comments below to let me know you're standing here with us. Your presence truly means the world. And if you haven't joined our community yet, I warmly invite you to subscribe and turn on that notification bell. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel, allowing us to keep crafting these deep, inspiring stories just for you. Now, let's lean back in. The plot is about to thicken. The drive to Harbor Point Bank felt like moving through thick molasses, every red traffic light along the coastal road a mocking reminder of the deep family betrayal she was speeding toward. The rhythmic, heavy thump of her old Subaru's tires over the cracked asphalt provided a steady, hollow soundtrack to her racing thoughts. Her knuckles were bone-white as she gripped the steering wheel, her breath frosting lightly against the chilly glass of the car window. Just a year ago, seated around a Thanksgiving turkey that Dorothy had insisted was too dry, Walter had made a bitter, offhand comment. His voice, rough with an old-fashioned prejudice that Eleanor had spent her entire adult life trying to politely ignore, had cut sharply through the holiday cheer. Valuable oceanfront properties shouldn't be wasted on single women when there are real family debts to pay. At the time, she had simply excused herself to the kitchen to fetch more cranberry sauce, chalking it up to his usual abrasive nature and his blind, unwavering favoritism toward her perpetually struggling younger brother. She hadn't realized it was a declaration of intent. It wasn't just a rude comment, it was the foundation of a theft. Eleanor pulled into the bank's sprawling asphalt lot, the cold sea breeze from the nearby Maine coastline immediately biting through her heavy wool coat as she stepped out. The interior of Harbor Point Bank in Oak Haven was exactly as she remembered it from her weekly deposits, though today it felt profoundly alien and unforgiving. It was polished, secure, and entirely sterile, a stark, highly organized contrast to the messy, deeply personal theft currently unfolding within its digital systems. The bright fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, continuous note that vibrated in her teeth. The subtle scent of industrial carpet cleaner and fresh printer paper hung heavily in the air, mixing seamlessly with the muted, polite conversations of local residents depositing their paychecks and discussing the upcoming winter storms. She didn't stop at the velvet ropes of the teller line. Eleanor walked straight toward the back, her sensible leather shoes clicking sharply and purposefully against the polished tile, until she reached David's glass-walled office. The branch manager was already standing behind his mahogany desk, his face drawn, pale, and incredibly somber. He gestured respectfully to a plush leather chair, but Eleanor remained standing. Her posture was rigid, locked into a newfound, quiet determination. She was actively transitioning from the initial, breathless shock of a victim into the highly focused, protective state of a woman defending her only sanctuary. David didn't waste time with empty pleasantries. He had known her for over a decade and recognized the devastating emotional toll this was taking on the quiet librarian. Turning his large computer monitor slightly so it faced her side of the desk, he clicked open a secure digital file. "This is the refinance packet they submitted yesterday," he said quietly, ensuring his voice didn't carry beyond the thick glass walls. Eleanor leaned in, bracing her hands on the edge of the desk. Her stomach executed a slow, sickening roll as she stared at the glowing screen. There, on the bottom line of a heavy, legally binding financial document she had never laid eyes on before, was her name. It was a nearly perfect forgery, expertly capturing the sweeping loops and precise slants of her handwriting, but she immediately recognized the slight, telltale tremor in the ascenders. It was her mother's careful, practiced imitation. Dorothy had actually sat at a desk, held a pen, and systematically stolen her daughter's identity, stroke by agonizing stroke. "They didn't do this alone, Eleanor," David continued, his finger pointing to a digital seal stamped firmly near the forged signature. He zoomed in on the notary mark. The name, rendered in stark, official blue ink, read Brenda Cole. David kept his voice exceptionally low, leaning closer across the desk. "Brenda is a third-party closer. She operates as a facilitator for a company called Coastal Signings LLC. Our internal compliance team has a documented history with her. She's known for aggressively pushing through irregular closings. She specifically targets cases like this, utilizing family members to make fraudulent transfers look like a simple domestic misunderstanding or a routine estate update." Eleanor felt a deep, piercing chill that had absolutely nothing to do with the Maine winter. Her parents hadn't just made a desperate, impulsive mistake in a moment of weakness. They had actively hired a seasoned professional to systematically bypass the bank's security protocols. But the most devastating blow of the morning was yet to come. David clicked to the final tab of the document package. "This is what triggered our immediate compliance alert, Eleanor." He opened the wire transfer instructions. The screen displayed a massive, life-altering sum in bold black font, $240,000. It was scheduled to be wired out by the close of business today to an account under a newly formed corporate entity called Seabright Consulting LLC. David gently tapped his silver pen against the screen, right beneath the beneficiary line. It read W. Vance. Walter Vance. Her own father. He wasn't just attempting to take out a small loan to cover a missed mortgage payment for her brother. He was actively, ruthlessly siphoning the entire equity of her life's sanctuary directly into his own pocket, leaving her with a massive debt she could never repay. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the small office, thick enough to choke on. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief, agonizing second, silently mourning the final, absolute death of her familial bonds. When she opened them, her gaze was clear, hard, and uncompromising. "Stop it," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady and devoid of tears. "Stop the transfer right now." David nodded immediately, his hands already flying across his keyboard with practiced speed. "I already placed an internal fraud hold on the wire the moment I saw the discrepancy this morning. Not a single cent is leaving this branch." A momentary wave of profound relief washed over Eleanor, loosening the tight, painful band around her chest. However, David stopped typing. He leaned back in his leather chair, his expression growing even graver than before. He looked at Eleanor with a deep, sympathetic sorrow that made her breath catch all over again. "But there's a massive legal loophole we have to address right now, and the bank cannot fix it for you. The physical deed of trust and a fabricated power of attorney have already been electronically submitted to the Seabrook County Recorder's Office by Coastal Signings. We can freeze the money here in the branch, David warned, his eyes dark with serious concern, but if the county officially records those documents today, your parents will legally own your home. The Seabrook County Recorder's office smelled of dusty paper archives and stale air conditioning, a sprawling bureaucratic maze where Eleanor's entire future now hung precariously in the balance. She had gripped her steering wheel so tightly on the short, frantic drive over that her knuckles turned a stark, painful white. It was an involuntary physical reaction mirroring the exact same way she had joyfully clutched that very will the day she made her final mortgage payment 5 years ago. Back then, it was the thrill of pure, unadulterated ownership, the quiet triumph of a single woman securing her own peaceful piece of the Maine coastline. Now, that same grip was fueled by a desperate, protective fury against the people who were supposed to love her most. The interior of the local government building was a symphony of administrative drudgery, entirely indifferent to her personal catastrophe. Bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights illuminated long, shuffling lines of local residents waiting patiently at heavy, scratched wooden counters. A large, circular wall clock ticked with a heavy, mechanical rhythm that seemed far too loud, ruthlessly counting down the minutes she had left to secure her sanctuary before the bank closed. Eleanor bypassed the general inquiry line, her sensible leather shoes carrying her straight to the property records desk. She informed the young clerk, her voice remarkably level despite the violent tremors shaking her hands, that highly fraudulent documents regarding her residential parcel had been submitted. Recognizing the gravity in the older woman's tone, the clerk immediately stepped away and returned a moment later with Denise. Denise, the county recording supervisor, was a sharp, no-nonsense veteran of the office. At 55, she possessed the kind of pragmatic empathy earned through decades of witnessing the messy, often heartbreaking financial realities of local families. Without wasting a single breath on empty pleasantries, Denise pulled up the county's digital e-recording queue. Her seasoned fingers flew across the keyboard, her eyes scanning the complex database. A moment later, her brow furrowed deeply, the lines around her mouth tightening. She looked up and confirmed Eleanor's absolute worst fear. A third-party company named Coastal Signings LLC had indeed submitted a deed of trust alongside a limited power of attorney just a few short hours prior. The deceptive documents were currently sitting in the system, pending final review. Moving with practiced, comforting efficiency, Denise reached under her desk and slid a heavy, multi-page paper packet across the worn wooden counter. It was a formal fraud affidavit. As Eleanor uncapped her pen to begin filling out her sworn statement, her cell phone, resting face up on the counter, started vibrating relentlessly. The screen illuminated with a rapid succession of incoming text messages from her mother, Dorothy. The preview text glared up at her, dripping with weaponized maternal concern. "Eleanor, please don't make a fuss over a simple family misunderstanding. We are doing this for your own good. Call me before you ruin everything." Eleanor stared down at the glowing rectangle, feeling a sudden, intense wave of nausea. The psychological manipulation was as clear as the crisp autumn air outside. For decades, Dorothy and Walter had used the guise of family love to mask taking advantage of her quiet generosity, always demanding unwarranted sacrifices to cover her brother's reckless debts. A younger, more pliable Eleanor might have paused right then, crippled by the deeply ingrained guilt of filial piety that her generation had been raised on. But the woman standing in the recorder's office, fiercely fighting for the home she had paid for with her own sweat and dedication, was finally, irrevocably done. Choosing her hard-earned independence over a deeply toxic family loyalty, Eleanor silently reached out and turned the phone face down against the wood. She signed the extensive affidavit with a steady, uncompromising hand right in front of the county's in-house notary, refusing to let her family's shadow dictate her future. Denise took the thick stack of papers and officially stamped the document with a heavy, resounding thud that echoed like a gavel. The supervisor looked Eleanor directly in the eyes, her voice a comforting anchor of bureaucratic authority. She explained that she had just entered an emergency temporary hold on the property parcel. This critical action absolutely prevented the fraudulent recording from completing until a full, comprehensive legal review was conducted by the county attorney. Eleanor let out a long, shaky breath, the terrible tension leaving her shoulders in a rush of profound relief. She had done it. The paper trail of theft was officially frozen. Just as Eleanor opened her mouth to express her deep, heartfelt gratitude to Denise for her swift solidarity, the supervisor's desk phone rang sharply. Denise picked up the receiver, her expression shifting instantly from supportive warmth to fiercely alert professionalism. It was a direct line from David back at Harbor Point Bank. Denise listened intently, her eyes darting to Eleanor with a renewed sense of urgency. The supervisor covered the mouthpiece and whispered that someone was currently inside the bank lobby, aggressively demanding an internal manual override to force the massive wire transfer through before the county's protective hold could properly update across the banking network system. Eleanor's phone buzzed again, this time with an urgent, chilling text from David, "Get back to the branch right now. Your parents are here, and they brought the notary. Eleanor is walking right into the lion's den, and the tension is higher than ever." If you're still watching this video and finding value in the deep details of her journey, please drop a 1 in the comments below just to let me know you're still here with us. I'd also absolutely love it if you could leave a meaningful comment or a warm wish for Eleanor as she prepares to stand her ground. And if you haven't joined our community yet, I highly recommend hitting that subscribe button and turning on the notification bell so you never miss a single video. Your incredible support is what helps us continue creating great content to inform and inspire you every day. Now, take a deep breath, and let's continue. The automatic glass doors of Harbor Point Bank slid open, letting in the crisp November wind, but it was the freezing, entitled glare from Eleanor's mother that truly chilled the room. Before stepping inside the sterile lobby, Eleanor had caught a fleeting glimpse of a familiar, faded Ford pickup truck pulling into the far end of the bank's parking lot, though her mind was too frantic to place it. Her entire focus was locked entirely on the immediate, suffocating threat waiting for her inside. The bustling, brightly lit lobby of Harbor Point Bank in Oakhaven suddenly felt less like a financial institution and more like a cruel, highly public theater stage. Tellers were already whispering behind their polished counters, their eyes darting nervously toward the loud commotion near the glossy brochure rack. The highly professional, sterile environment starkly contrasted with the ugly, deeply personal family dispute unfolding on the beige tile. Eleanor had barely stepped entirely through the double doors before she was immediately ambushed by Dorothy. Her mother was wearing her Sunday best, a meticulously tailored wool coat and a perfectly set string of pearls, and she instantly put on a loud, tearful performance designed entirely for the captive audience of local Maine residents. "Eleanor, darling, thank goodness you're here," Dorothy cried out, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, manufactured relief that made Eleanor's stomach churn. Dorothy turned to the nearest customer, a retired local fisherman holding a deposit slip, and sighed heavily, playing the role of the burdened matriarch. "My daughter is just so overworked and confused. Being a single woman at her age, the stress of managing a large property is simply too much for her fragile state to bear alone. We're just trying to help her manage her affairs before she makes a terrible mistake." Walter stood right behind his wife, his posture rigid and his expression carved from unyielding stone. He weaponized his advanced age and his traditional parental authority with practiced, ruthless ease, trying to guilt-trip Eleanor into immediate, silent submission. "This is a necessary family transaction, Eleanor," Walter stated, his voice a low, stern rumble meant to project absolute patriarchal control across the room. "Your brother is drowning in debt, and it is our fundamental duty as a family to pull him out. You have more than enough, sitting entirely alone in that big house overlooking the water. We are simply taking what should rightfully be shared to save your own flesh and blood. You are making a terrible, selfish scene over a routine business matter." He spoke with the terrifying, absolute conviction of a man who truly believed that his middle-aged daughter's life savings were nothing more than his own personal emergency fund. While her parents provided the loud, distracting emotional theater to keep the lobby's attention, the real, systemic threat was operating silently and aggressively in the background. Brenda Cole, the fraudulent notary from Coastal Signings LLC, was leaning far over the lowered counter of a young, visibly intimidated teller named Kevin. Brenda was sweating slightly under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights, her designer perfume masking the scent of her growing panic, but she used aggressive, rapid-fire professional jargon to bulldoze the young man. "The county hold is nothing more than a temporary system glitch, Kevin," Brenda snapped, tapping a sharp, manicured fingernail hard against the laminated counter. "I am the authorized closing facilitator on this file, and you need to process an internal manual override for this wire transfer right now. If you hold up a legally binding $240,000 escrow because of a localized computer error, my firm will hold this branch and you personally liable for the damages." Push the wire through the system. For decades, Eleanor had quietly swallowed her pride to keep the peace, retreating into the quiet, predictable safety of her library books rather than fighting her parents' toxic, endless demands. But the independent, resilient woman who had just sworn a fraud affidavit at the county recorder's office was no longer willing to be a convenient victim. Channeling the fierce, hard-earned independence she had built over decades of honest labor, Eleanor flatly refused to back down. She stepped firmly past her mother's outstretched, theatrical arms and stood dead center in the lobby. She spoke loudly, clearly, and with absolute, unwavering conviction, ensuring her voice was captured by both the security cameras overhead and the breathless, silent lobby. "I did not authorize this refinance," Eleanor stated, her voice ringing out like a clarion bell, cutting through the thick layer of gaslighting. "My signature was forged. You are not trying to help me, and this is not a family misunderstanding. You are actively trying to steal my home, and I will not let you take another dime from me." The sheer, unapologetic truth of her words shattered Dorothy's fragile victim act. Dorothy's mouth dropped open in genuine, ugly shock. She was entirely unaccustomed to her daughter fighting back in public. Brenda, realizing the emotional manipulation had utterly failed and her window to steal the money was rapidly closing, abandoned her subtle approach with the terrified teller and sneered. She spun around, her face flushed with desperate anger, and tried to use her fake authority to override the entire system by sheer volume. "David!" Brenda shouted toward the manager's glass office, her voice shrill and demanding. "Release the funds immediately. We have signed, notarized authorization, and you are unlawfully holding our client's money." Walter stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous, mottled shade of red. He raised his fist slightly, stepping into David's personal space to physically intimidate the manager, who had quickly emerged from his office to protect his young staff and his client. The suffocating pressure in the room reached a dangerous boiling point, the threat of physical intimidation and legal threats hanging thick in the stale air. Before David could instruct the security guard to intervene, heavy footsteps echoed from the entrance, and a calm, commanding voice cut through the shouting. "That won't be necessary, because the authorities are already here." The flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the bank's polished glass brought an immediate, breathless silence to the chaotic lobby. The loud, entitled shouting from Walter and Dorothy evaporated instantly as two uniformed Oakhaven police officers stepped through the sliding double doors, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy-duty belts. They didn't rush in with drawn weapons or bark orders, they simply took up strategic positions by the main exits, projecting an air of absolute, unyielding authority that instantly quelled the ugly family drama. Brenda Cole's hand froze mid-air, her manicured nail hovering just inches from the terrified young teller's counter. The suffocating tension in the room immediately shifted from the aggressive heat of a domestic dispute to the cold, clinical reality of an active crime scene. Then, a third figure walked through the doors. The faint, comforting scent of diner coffee and cinnamon briefly flickered in Eleanor's memory as the lead investigator stepped forward, his posture demanding absolute, unquestionable authority. Walter and Dorothy visibly relaxed for a fraction of a second, their old-fashioned prejudices assuming that a formal, official investigator would naturally side with upstanding, elderly parents over a hysterical, middle-aged daughter. Eleanor, however, let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. The man commanding the room wasn't a stranger. It was Artie. The scruffy, exhausted man from the Oakhaven diner who had been wearing a frayed flannel coat and shivering in the autumn chill was completely gone. In his place stood Arthur Sterling, senior fraud investigator for Seabrook County. He was dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, a gold detective's badge clipped prominently to his leather belt. His posture was remarkably straight, his shoulders broad, and the faded tattoos on his hands were no longer the marks of a defeated outcast, but the visible symbols of a seasoned man who had seen the darkest corners of human greed. Artie's sharp, piercing eyes swept across the frozen lobby and landed immediately on Eleanor. For a fleeting, almost imperceptible second, the hardened, unyielding detective vanished. His stern expression softened with deep, silent gratitude. He offered her a minuscule nod, a profound, unspoken acknowledgement of the warm pecan pie, the steaming coffee, and, most importantly, the unconditional dignity she had shown him when he was working a grueling, weeks-long undercover operation, feeling entirely invisible to the world. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the warmth vanished, replaced by absolute, terrifying ice as he turned his piercing attention to Brenda Cole and Eleanor's parents. "David," Artie said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly across the silent bank. "I suggest we move this conversation into your office. Right now." The transition from the public lobby to the glass-walled confines of the manager's office felt like a slow march to the gallows for the perpetrators. Once the heavy glass door clicked shut, sealing them off from the whispering tellers and curious onlookers, Artie didn't bother with polite introductions. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, pulled a thick, official-looking file from his leather briefcase, and dropped it onto David's mahogany desk with a heavy, definitive thud that made Dorothy flinch. "Arthur Sterling, Seabrook County Financial Crimes," he announced, staring dead at the fraudulent notary. "I've been reviewing the digital trail supervisor Denise forwarded from the recorder's office. You've been exceptionally busy today, Ms. Cole." Brenda swallowed hard, her aggressive, bulldozing professional facade crumbling like cheap plaster. "Investigator Sterling," she stammered, attempting a weak, practiced smile that didn't reach her panicked eyes. "There's been a massive misunderstanding here. I am simply the third-party closing facilitator. I was assured by the clients," she gestured frantically toward Walter and Dorothy, desperately trying to shift the blame, "that they had full, documented legal authority to execute this transaction on their daughter's behalf." Artie didn't even blink. He methodically opened the file, exposing Brenda's layered fraudulent documents to the harsh office light. "You bypassed standard identity verification protocols, you utilized a compromised e-recording credential to submit a forged power of attorney, and you actively attempted to force a manual override on a frozen wire transfer while fully aware that the primary property owner had sworn a fraud affidavit. That isn't a clerical misunderstanding, Ms. Cole. That is a highly coordinated attempt to bypass a federal banking hold." Walter, realizing the situation was rapidly spiraling completely out of his control, puffed out his chest and tried one last time to assert his authority as the patriarch. He glared at Artie, trying to dismiss the seasoned detective with the same arrogant disdain he showed everyone. "Now listen here, young man," Walter growled, pointing a trembling, liver-spotted finger. "You are blowing a private, internal family business transaction completely out of proportion. We are her parents. We raised her. We are simply reallocating family assets to help her brother. You have absolutely no right to interfere in our private family matters." Artie's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening into a hard, unforgiving line. He reached into the thick file and pulled out the final wire transfer document, slamming it onto the desk right in front of Walter. He tapped a heavy finger directly onto the beneficiary line. "This isn't a family reallocation, Mr. Vance," Artie stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy or respect for the older man's title. "This is an unauthorized, forged cash-out refinance designed to funnel $240,000 into Seabright Consulting LLC, a shell company registered entirely in your name. This is attempted grand larceny and elder financial abuse." The devastating realization finally hit Walter and Dorothy with the crushing force of a freight train. Their lifelong emotional manipulation, their weaponized guilt, and their assumed parental immunity meant absolutely nothing in the face of hard, incontrovertible digital evidence and the cold, unbending reality of the law. They weren't respected, untouchable elders in this glass room, they were criminal suspects. Brenda, realizing she had been caught red-handed by the county's top investigator and that her lucrative, illicit career was effectively over, began to hyperventilate. The color completely drained from her face. Brenda paled and reached for her designer bag to flee toward the side exit, but Artie's heavy hand clamped down on the mahogany desk as he said, "You aren't going anywhere, Miss Cole. You're under arrest." The sharp metallic click of handcuffs closing around Brenda Cole's wrist sounded like the definitive end to a nightmare Eleanor had never asked for. The abrasive, demanding notary who had tried to bulldoze her way through a massive wire transfer was now visibly trembling, her designer bag left forgotten on a lobby chair as the two uniformed Oakhaven officers gently but firmly escorted her toward the sliding glass doors. The harsh reality of the law had finally punctured the bubble of arrogant deception she and Eleanor's parents had tried to build. Walter and Dorothy, stripped entirely of their weaponized parental authority and entitled indignation, were separated by another pair of detectives who had arrived on the scene. They were being formally cited and prepared for transport to the station for extensive questioning regarding elder financial abuse and attempted grand larceny. Eleanor stood near the edge of David's glass-walled office, her arms wrapped tightly around her own shoulders. She watched her aging parents being led away, their heads bowed, the heavy weight of their own greed finally pulling them down. For decades, she had carried the exhausting burden of trying to please them, of constantly bending to their demands to cover her brother's reckless mistakes, and of internalizing their harsh judgments about her independent life. Seeing them face the severe, uncompromising consequences of their actions brought a complex wave of emotion over her. There was a profound, aching sadness for the loving, supportive parents she had always desperately wished for but never truly had. Yet, rising powerfully beneath that sorrow was a deep, incredible sense of liberating relief. The toxic, invisible chains of guilt they had wrapped around her for her entire adult life were finally broken. She was safe, and she was free. As the chaotic energy of the arrests cleared the bank lobby, leaving only the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, Arthur Sterling lingered behind. The senior fraud investigator instructed his colleagues to go ahead, then turned and walked slowly back toward Eleanor. The terrifying, icy authority he had wielded against the fraudsters had completely vanished, replaced by a warm, deeply human softness that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Are you holding up all right, Miss Vance?" Artie asked, his resonant baritone incredibly gentle. Eleanor let out a long, shaky exhale, offering a small, grateful smile. "I will be. Thanks to you, Investigator Sterling. I don't even know how to begin to repay you for coming down here yourself." Artie chuckled softly, a warm, rumbling sound. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp $10 bill, placing it gently on the edge of David's mahogany desk. "You already did, Eleanor. A month ago." He looked at her, his expression filled with profound respect. "When you saw me at the Oakhaven diner, I was on day 12 of a grueling undercover assignment. I was cold, I was exhausted to my bones, and I felt entirely invisible to the world. People looked right through me, or worse, they looked at me with disgust because of the frayed coat and the old tattoos. But you didn't." He paused, his eyes bright with unspoken emotion. "You didn't just buy me a hot cup of dark roast and the best slice of pecan pie in the county. You gave me back my dignity on a morning when I was completely running on empty. You looked at me like a human being who deserved a warm seat. When your name popped up on the emergency fraud alert from the county recorder's office this morning, I recognized it instantly. I wasn't going to let anyone take the home of a woman with a heart like yours. Kindness, Eleanor, always has a way of finding its way back home." The beautiful truth of his words settled deep into her soul, providing a healing balm to the fresh wounds left by her family. A few short weeks later, the turbulent events at Harbor Point Bank felt like a distant, fading storm. It was Thanksgiving morning in Maine. The air was brutally cold, carrying the sharp, salty tang of the Atlantic Ocean, but inside Eleanor's beach house, everything was brilliantly warm. The property was entirely secure, the locks had been changed, and permanent fraud alerts actively guarded her accounts. She stood alone on her weathered wooden deck, wrapped securely in her favorite oversized wool sweater, holding a steaming ceramic mug of freshly brewed drip coffee. The house was quiet, but for the first time in her 55 years, Eleanor didn't feel lonely. She felt completely whole. She listened to the rhythmic, soothing crash of the ocean waves against the rocky shoreline, breathing in the crisp morning air. She had let go of the toxic family expectations that had weighed her down, choosing instead to celebrate the beautiful, quiet life she had built with her own two hands. As she sipped her warm coffee and looked out at the endless horizon, Eleanor knew for certain that the truest wealth any person could possess was a kind, non-judgmental heart. Eleanor's journey reminds us that the heaviest chains we carry are often forged by those closest to us, yet the keys to our true freedom are found in the simplest acts of grace. When we choose to look past the frayed edges of a person's appearance and offer dignity without expectation, we open the door to life-saving compassion. Like a quiet beacon in a cold Maine winter, unconditional kindness always has a profound way of finding its way back home to protect us when we need it most. As I reflect on this story, it deeply moves me to see how a gentle, non-judgmental heart, not a hardened one, is ultimately our greatest armor in this life. If Eleanor's resilience and Artie's quiet strength touched your heart today, please share your own stories of unexpected kindness in the comments below. And to join our growing family of listeners who value justice, warmth, and the beautiful resilience of the human spirit, please consider subscribing to Retribution Raw. We would be absolutely honored to have you with us for the next journey.